Those of you in the back center, move over so we can get some more chairs in, please. Lecture tonight is part of a four-part series of lectures called Science, Technology, and the Future. The second lecture will be by Bernard Gendron on October the 18th, and it's called Can Democracy Withstand Technology? The series was sponsored by the Philosophy Department and the following other organizations: the Committee on Lectures, the Machette Foundation, the Graduate College, College of Science and Humanities, the Departments of Psychology, Computer Science and Political Science, Programs of Technology and Social Change, and Molecular, Cellular, and Developmental Biology. After the talk tonight, there'll be a reception in the Cardinal Room. That's, let's see, on the main level, the east end of the building. Everyone's invited to attend that. Sherry and cheese and so forth. Okay, the speaker tonight is Michael Scriven. He's currently the founder and the head of the Center for Educational Evaluation at University of San Francisco. He was formerly a professor of philosophy at University of California, Berkeley. He was educated, I guess, master's degree from Melbourne University and PhD in philosophy from Oxford University. He's held research positions at the Minnesota Center for the Philosophy of Science and the Center for Advanced Studies in the Behavioral and Social Sciences at Stanford University. He's the author of some 200 or so articles and about 12 books. Tonight he's going to talk to us about moral and scientific reasoning. Professor Scriven.
I want to talk tonight about a most fundamental kind of dualism, distinction, dichotomy that most of the materials that we study at the college level are grounded in, and most of our instructors at the college level regard as being a fundamentally correct dichotomy. The distinction between the scientific and the moral domains, the distinction between facts and values, the distinction between means and ends, the distinction between descriptive and normative, the distinction between the is and the ought. These many names for what is, in many respects, the same distinction are a sign of its importance. It crops up throughout our curriculum. It crops up in the study of the social sciences when you hear the lecturer in the introductory course talking about the importance of separating the scientific enterprise, the search for the facts, the search for the correct description, from the evaluative or normative enterprise in which we ascribe goodness or merit to something or other. That, we are told, is, so to speak, our business as citizens to do, our duty as individuals to think about, to consult our conscience about, but it is not and cannot properly be part of the task of the scientist. This dualism, this separation into two parts of the enterprise of the search for truth, the search for scientific truth, and the search for the ethical truth, always results, as do dualisms of this kind, in a competition of some kind. And in this competition, the ethics never got much of a chance. Science was extremely successful. It has boomed in every dimension within the curriculum and within the economy, to the point where it is an empire of colossal scope and enormous power. And it has not been slow to claim objectivity as part of its province. Hence, we are told implicitly, if not explicitly, frequently enough explicitly, that the domain of objectivity is not, does not overlap with that of morals or ethics. The impact of that on our society, the impact of that colossal commitment of an educational system in which moral education is excluded more or less on the grounds that the separation of church and state requires it, so that it occurs only in the private school, church-related schools, a university system dominated by departments committed to the similar exclusion of the moral domain from the domain of factual, objective inquiry, is to produce fundamental moral relativism in the society. It would be possible to look for other sources for that in our pluralistic ecological ancestry as the result of varying waves of immigration from varying other societies with various religious and social commitments, but one doesn't even need to look that far. The educational system of this society is basically committed to teaching relativism. Now, relativism is essentially the denial of objectivity in the ethical domain. Ethical relativism is the denial of objectivity in the ethical domain. It is the assertion or the implicit assumption that everybody's opinion in ethics is essentially as valuable as each other person's opinion. The situation is perfectly clear in the domain of aesthetics. We're quite familiar with the idea that one person's taste for a particular type of wine or a particular type of art is not the same as anybody else's, and only in art departments at the university do they attempt to sell you on the idea that there is a correct evaluative scale in aesthetics. Most normal people basing their thoughts upon common sense or good philosophy have long ago abandoned the idea to try to determine which type of art is superior to which other. But in ethics, it is a more debatable question whether we should give up on objectivity quite so easily. What I want to do tonight is to run through some of the major moves in the chain of argument that has attempted to establish, that has been accepted either explicitly or implicitly, as the intellectual basis for this view about the separation of and the superiority of one of these two domains of reasoning, the scientific and the moral. And I want to indicate to you not just that I don't agree with some of these steps, but at least some of the reasons why virtually all of these steps are, in fact, completely fallacious. One of the problems in this area is that it is difficult to survive one's allies' support. That is, there have been immense attacks upon this distinction in recent years, beginning with the wave of the radical movement in the general political field, and then the wave of radical movements within the disciplines, so that radical caucuses were set up in sociology and set up in political science and so on. And all of these sounded the same theme, namely that the idea of value-free social science was a fallacy, that science, in fact, had value commitments, that some of them were very bad, and the time had come for us to be explicit about them. Now, that line of argument is all right as far as it goes, but it was wrongly supposed that it showed there was something wrong with the doctrines on which the distinction between facts and values were based. It was wrongly thought that the discovery that in Project Camelot a substantial number of social scientists were powerfully supporting the machinations of a dictator trying to put down reform groups in other societies, and thus were in fact implicitly lending scientific support to dictatorship and against what appeared to be reasonably legitimate agrarian reform movements. It was wrongly thought that discovering that this sort of thing was going on was the hidden agenda of much of the social sciences, showed that there was no such thing as value-free social science, and so you might as well be on the side of the angels, namely the radicals, namely the left. And that was indeed where the radicals would like to get you, so they were happy to have you view the general argument in those terms. They became politically and to some degree intellectually powerful, and the establishment of the academic disciplines decided, I think judiciously, that it wasn't worth having this brawl in public, because in the public arena they would probably lose. However, they were completely unaffected by the points that were being made, since they were completely irrelevant to the position of value-free social science, of empiricism, of the separation of science from ethics. And it's as well to understand, therefore, that although if you look superficially at the status of value analysis or moral and ethical dimensions in scientific work today, you will see a great deal more of it on the program of the professional meetings. a great deal of general attention to it. We have not in any way fractured the core of the body of thought here. So this is a case where the people that are on the side of, the same side as I'm arguing for tonight, are in fact by a very large majority on that side for reasons which have absolutely nothing to do with the issue. Consequently, it is important for us to try to get our heads straight about this, or else we will finish up simply being on a bandwagon which happens to be going in this direction at the moment, but we could expect it to swing back in a year or two, backlash towards pure research and so on. As long as our arguments about it are as uninformed as most of them have been in the past few years, then we will be all too easily swayed by fashion and opinion in these matters and slip back into the opposite position because other people slip in that direction. Well, what is the general structure of this argument? It begins with this very attractive idea that there is a distinction in logic and in common sense between factual claims and evaluative claims. The distinction goes back a very long way in the history of thought, most powerfully resuscitated by Hume, but to be found going back to the Greeks quite clearly. So a very attractive dichotomy is that between fact and value, with science, of course, to be concerned with this, and ethics to be concerned with this. But we want to be clear that ethics is, of course, only one type of value. There are aesthetic values, and there are practical values, and a long list of other values as well. The one we're concerned with particularly tonight is ethics, and we're talking about the relationship of that kind of reasoning to scientific reasoning, but there are other kinds. Now, the other language that goes along with this is the language of is as opposed to ought. Ought is a recommendation, is a description. The language of description as opposed to recommendation. And sometimes that's put by talking about description, descriptive as opposed to normative, which means recommendatory. And somewhere buried in here, from Aristotle's time on, is the distinction between the means and the end. The means being the practical matter, the matter for science to tell us about, for engineering to devise, the end being the value in terms of which we're to judge the means. So the dualism runs very deep. It reflects itself in all these distinctions, none of them quite the same as each other, but nevertheless very closely related. Now, if you had to make a really simple-minded suggestion about what science is about, you might be attracted by the idea that it's about the facts and that talking about values is something for another area of discussion. But it is simple-minded. Suppose we just approach this in a scientific way. Suppose, that is, we simply ask ourselves, what do the journals contain? What do the scientific journals have as content? Open a volume of Nature, of the Proceedings of the Royal Society, of the American Journal of Physics, at random. Start reading what you see on that page. You will certainly see a good deal of factual material, a good deal of descriptive material. But after a while, you'll come either to the beginning of an article or to the end of an article, or to a section within an article which starts talking about the experimental design or about the previous work on the same subject, and lo and behold, we find that certain people have done outstanding work, others have done inferior work, that an experimental design is excellent, that another is unsatisfactory, that somebody or other made a brilliant contribution, and so on and so on. These are not ethical judgments, but they're unmistakably value judgments. They are judgments about the value, merit, and worth of things. In this case, scientists, experimental designs, research projects. These are evaluations. Remember that there are a number of different types of value, and this is not, at the moment, the ethical type. but it is the thin end of the wedge, because the claim was that you didn't find that kind of judgment within science. Yet as we look more closely at science and we start asking ourselves basic questions like what's the difference between science and, say, if there happens to be a particular bugaboo of ours, astrology, or something else that we think of as unscientific, we begin to realize that even to call something scientific is itself a very, very powerful evaluation of it. And to call something else unscientific is itself an evaluation. To regard a theory as an exceptionally elegant one is not just to make an aesthetic judgment, it is to make a judgment of scientific merit. Throughout science, we find, and in talking even about the boundaries of science, we find then evaluative judgments occurring. Now, nothing follows from this about the fact that scientists have to take an ethical stand on issues. It's nothing to do with ethics. It is simply to do with evaluation. Well, couldn't one simply fall back and say, look, the position is science talks about what is, and perhaps a little bit about what ought to be scientifically speaking. But it doesn't talk about what ought to be socially speaking, or it doesn't talk about what ought to be morally or ethically speaking. Notice that we've already destroyed the nice, simple division here. We've found that all this language, this bad language about good and bad, turns up in the scientific papers. Now, is it dispensable? Could we remove it and have something left that was the whole of science, essentially the whole of science? Is it just the wrapping, just the icing on the cake? Certainly not. It represents the culmination, the pulling together, the synthesis of all the hard work. It's the hardest judgment to make, whether you should say with special relativity theory or whether in fact at this stage it has been so damaged by the observations that you have to judge it lacking in merit. That value judgment is what all the fooling around with the astronomical observations is for. There isn't a point to these activities unless they separate good theories from bad theories, good hypotheses from bad theories, bad hypotheses, good taxonomies from bad taxonomies, good accounts of the mating habits of the gibbon from bad accounts of the mating habit of the gibbon, good observations from bad observations, good measurement from bad measurement. Good and bad is what it's all about, not morally good and bad. Good and bad in terms of the canons of the disciplines themselves, but values, big fat values. Now, one reason that this is so important, it's not just trivia that we're talking about, not just a sort of idle doodling with sentimental comments by the scientist on the basic core of scientific research that she or he has done. One reason it's not just doodling like that is that some of the main arguments that were supposed to prove the sharpness of this distinction, in fact, collapse completely from looking at these examples. For example, the is and ought issue is a very simple one in logical terms. It just goes like this. If you're going to have a conclusion which has got ought in it, based on any factual premises, then you're not going to have a valid argument. You can't get to a conclusion which has ought in it from a set of premises which simply describe the way the world is. Hence, it follows that you can't get a value judgment from science, because science describes the way the world is, and from that you cannot logically infer a conclusion about how the world ought to be. You can't infer it because you can't get something in a conclusion that isn't in one of the premises. You can't infer a conclusion which contains some reference to atoms unless there's some reference to atoms in the premises. You can't have a conclusion which refers to ought unless there's an ought in one of the premises. That is, unless you have a value premise, unless you've made a value assumption. If you're only going to use factual or scientific or descriptive or is assumptions as premises, the sort of thing that you can convert from assumptions into demonstrated fact by scientific procedures, then you're never going to have an ought in the conclusion, if the argument's going to be a legitimate argument. Now, that is so persuasive. It is really the mother's milk of most scientists and virtually all social scientists alive today. It is stuffed into every text. It is referred to casually as received doctrine in every methodological comment by the great figures in the field. it is thought to be heresy to attack it, and the attack of the radicals was taken to be just a sign of political squeeze, political push come to political shove, a good point made about what people were doing out of school. They were being naughty out of school, right? It was correct to point this out. Okay, out of school, they ought to be good. But in school, they oughtn't to be either good or bad, because good or bad has nothing to do with what goes on in school. Now, what's wrong with that great argument? Well, what's wrong with the great argument is very simple. It rests on the assumption that there aren't any value premises in the scientific doctrine, in the scientific literature. Yet there are masses of them. We find masses of assertions. I mean, supposing somebody says Einstein was a great scientist. What are you going to say? That it's not true? That it can't be proved? That it's simply an injection of personal prejudices into a judgment of this individual? Einstein's a great scientist. It's demonstrable, not because he got the Nobel Prize, but because, in fact, he broke through in 3 different fields with completely new, radical reconceptualizations that led to massive new bodies of theory and enormous new technologies. It is possible to demonstrate that the breakthroughs were extremely important advances. They may not be the final word, but they were tremendous gains over the previously existing theories and conceptualizations. This is proving that these were great steps forward. Forward is a value judgment. They weren't just things that shook the scientific world as an earthquake might do so. These were things that altered our scientific task very significantly. It won't do to say that what happened after Einstein was just different from what happened before. What happened after Einstein was better because the theories that came up were able to make the predictions, provide the explanations, develop the taxonomies that couldn't previously be done. And doing that is what science is about, and doing it effectively is what identifies good science. Hence, the statement that he was a great scientist is incontrovertible, although evaluative. It's a fact about Einstein. It's as much a fact as that he sometimes worked in Zurich. He was a great scientist who lived in Zurich a great deal of his life. I mean, that's just a couple of facts about him. Now, if you think perhaps that the evaluation of scientists is a little bit too much into the Reader's Digest area, and that we ought to stay with matters that are closer to the heart of science, just start looking at what a book like Fisher's Design of Experiments did for scientific research. It was a great breakthrough. It introduced brilliant new designs that represented great steps forward in our capacity to analyze agricultural and, in many cases, educational contexts more effectively. This is an evaluation of experimental designs. It's saying that they were very, very valuable ones, that they were great contributions to scientific progress. Is that evaluation just a non-scientific evaluation? Is it not based on evidence? Is it not an objective claim? I don't say that these claims that I'm putting forward couldn't possibly be disputed by some extremely clever person who has thought of a lot of arguments nobody has yet thought of. But for the same reason, we could easily say that it may well turn out that everything behind this wallpaper is water. It might turn out that way. It's certainly possible, but it's not something which you would be well advised to bet a nickel on. So, in terms of establishing the certainty without making a biased assumption or an arbitrary assumption, of a value assertion, an ought assertion, for example, an ought assertion based on those experimental design things would be something very simple, like you look at an experimental design, you say, you ought to have used a Latin square design. You have simply got a weak design because you didn't use Latin square. You could easily have done it. Fisher showed you how. Anybody reasonably competent since 1931 would know how to do it. You were not, therefore you were not reasonable, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So basically it's trivial, easy to produce ought claims from these factual premises. Well, logically, how did we manage to pull off this mysterious trick? Well, we've pulled it off because one of our premises involves a definition of what science is about, the function of science, the aim of science, the goal of science. Science merit is to be judged by the extent to which it manages to achieve the following things. So there's a value premise, all right. The logic isn't violated here, but the value premise happens to be a definitional one. It's a definitional one, therefore not debatable, therefore necessarily true. Therefore, we are able to get an evaluative conclusion out of purely factual premises plus the usual definitional assumptions that you make in any argument at all, because no argument can avoid assuming the meaning of the terms in it in order to get to its conclusion. Similarly with this one. Well, the fact then is that we can find large slices of proper, crucial, important scientific activities and decisions and conclusions which are evaluations. And consequently, you can't say, well, you can't get an ought conclusion out of that. You've already got ought conclusions. Science already has them built in. Any goal-oriented activity will automatically, by its very nature, be committed to conclusions about the value of certain, the merit, the worth, the demerit of some of the things that concern it. Now, it follows then that if you want to move to any of these other distinctions, for example, to say that science only describes, doesn't recommend, you're certainly going to have to fly in the face of the facts. And if you're a facts freak, as the so-called empiricist social scientists were, that's difficult for you to do. The facts are that in textbooks of experimental design and social sciences, it gives you recommendations about when to use fully controlled, fully randomized experimental designs. Recommendations. It doesn't say, if you do this, the following will result. That's a fairly trivial consequence of the conclusion. It summarizes a mass of considerations that are both empirical and methodological and analytic up by giving a recommendation. And it does it in a way that makes it ludicrous to suggest that that isn't a scientifically based recommendation. There aren't any better conclusions other than the merest, most boring raw observational data that are more reliable than that kind of conclusion. There's nothing you can find about the structure of the molecule that is can be more confidently asserted than the fact that if you use ex post facto designs, you will in fact almost inevitably get a weaker result than if you can use a fully controlled design, and therefore that you ought to use a fully controlled design whenever you can. So it won't do to act as if somehow the content of science is just that sort of thing. It is not. It is full of scientifically relevant recommendations, scientifically supportable, fully objective. Of course, there are plenty that aren't objective too, as there are outside of science. But there's a good big fat area where they're as objective as anything within science can be said to be. Now, that makes it very awkward to pull off the idea that the job of the scientist should not involve recommendations. The best version that can be salvaged from that is we can say that the job of the scientist should not involve ethical recommendations. We can salvage a little bit of the domain of recommendations and keep it outside of science, perhaps. In fact, that's going to fail, as we'll see in a moment. But that's the best thing that's left for you at the moment. So we have indicated a number of types of value judgment, and I've added a type there we should call methodological, the best method for investigating this, and so on. So the best type of top-loading balance that you can use in a situation where there isn't an excessively high velocity of air movement in the lab is so and so and so and so. These are all recommendations within the context of particular types of investigation, and we can easily find them within history, or we can find them within jurisprudence. They're not confined, or analogies to them, they're not confined to science, but they're a very common type of evaluative remark. Now, what can be said in the way of salvaging the last defense for the value-free view of science? The defense that says, well, at least it doesn't make ethical recommendations. I'm going to suggest two respects in which that thesis fails. One of them relatively easy to establish, but not tremendously significant. It's significant in the sense that it ruins the point, and it's the point of principle. but it doesn't affect most of science. And the other is to stand the whole position on its head and argue for the toughest possible counterposition, which is that ethics is a science. And hence the idea that science is value-free is as absurd as saying that it's chemistry-free. All right, we'll take them in that order so that you can try to focus on the fact that the first point, which is virtually, I think, impossible to refute, at least establishes the logical point solidly before we go on to the much more debatable second point about the nature of ethics itself. The first point is this: there are areas within science where moral judgments must enter as part of the scientific effort. Now, these will be, and you can see from kind of a preliminary look at it, these will have to be, by the nature of ethics, which concerns the relationship between human beings and the relationship between their attitudes and their behavior. The nature of these sciences that have exceptions to this dichotomy built into them will have to be sciences that are closely concerned with the behavior of human beings. Hence, the social and medical sciences are the most obvious cases. And a simple example would come from applied psychology, in particular, say, psychotherapy. In psychotherapy, you are attempting to apply the principles of clinical psychology for the benefit of individuals, and you must, amongst other things in your toolbox, have a way of identifying improvement. You do not have psychology for the benefit of individuals, and you must, amongst other things in your toolbox, have a way of identifying improvement. You do not have to have, contrary to many suggestions about this, a way to identify perfect mental health, fortunately. We might have trouble getting anywhere if we had to cross that bridge before we could start walking. But we do have to be able to identify improvement, because if we can't tell which end is up, then we don't know whether we're doing the patient any good or not. Improvement we must be able to recognize. And if we can recognize it, then we should be able to render explicit the criteria which identify it. Now, in psychotherapy, the crunch comes in cases like this. General improvement in self-perceived well-being. There's a catch. The catch is that you happen to have a contact through a psychiatric social worker who has done some previous house visiting in the case of this particular patient and has maintained some of those contacts. You discover that exactly paralleling the increase in well-being felt by the patient, there is an increase in the extent to which the patient is assaulting his wife and kids. Now, what are you going to do about it? The basic fact is that you're stuck with having to make a moral judgment. You cannot say, I suggest, that it's a satisfactory definition of improvement to find that the patient feels better. That is, of course, one dimension of improvement. It's perfectly appropriate to count it, but you cannot isolate it and put all your chips on it. To do so would clearly be talking about something other than the human situation. It seems essential that in such a situation you must be prepared to adopt the stance that the behavior of your patient towards other human beings must also be weighted, considered, examined, and analyzed in terms of the rights of those other human beings to their own world, their own activities, their own preferences and choices. And if you find that your patient, while gaining on one dimension, is losing very heavily on the other, then you must at least modify your judgment that this is unmitigated improvement. Now, that being so, you made a moral judgment, not just a judgment about the methodological superiority of one-on-one analysis, but a judgment about the relative worth of human beings and their welfare. How could you do psychotherapy unless you could make some kind of reasonably plausible moral judgment? Answer, you could do it immorally. So it looks as if there would be such a thing as a purely scientific approach to psychotherapy. You would identify something you were kind of interested in, like whether the guy stopped twitching his ears, and you would then apply the treatment until he stopped twitching his ears. Unfortunately, that happens to be called psychological research rather than psychotherapy. And interesting though it is, it's doubtful whether it justifies charging $50 an hour. Psychotherapy means making people better, means treating them for improvement. The medical commitment is a therapeutic commitment. It's not a research commitment. When I started work on looking at the scientific status of psychotherapy research many years ago, I naturally went very quickly for definitions of improvement. And of course, I found two sorts of approach. There was the fool's rush in approach, where they would say something like better in every possible way, which is nice, but unfortunately psychotherapy then flunks, because there's no evidence that it ever produces that sort of result on a consistent basis. The second approach was of people who saw the trap, and you would find them all over the place. And there are a couple of outstanding examples of people who say the goals of therapy are to increase knowledge. That is, the goals of therapy is research. That is, it's all right to find out what happens. You don't pass judgment on what happens. You just find out what happens. Of course, you could never sell an hour of therapy to a patient who knew that was your goal. Patients believe that the goal is to help them overcome the bad symptoms and to feel better in general, to be more functional. But the theorists, the therapists, and the theory of therapy people at that stage were very, very carefully hedging their bets. So they either sort of produced a nice definition with a moral component, but one which automatically got them into trouble for showing that anything good was coming out of psychotherapy, or they backed off and produced a component which would mean the FDA would immediately condemn them if they ever heard about it. So the situation has not changed very much for the better since. A nice move was made by some of the work that Eysenck and some other of the behavior therapists did, in which they said, look, we'll only take on patients where there is some malfunction about which there can be no dispute. For example, a very simple one, like a tic, or like a serious case of insomnia. And we will only allow that any improvement has resulted if that problem is abated significantly. So we'll be very careful about what counts as improvement. We won't get sloppy in general. That's nice, but of course it then runs into the problem of the first example I gave you. If they stop scratching their face all the time, but start kicking their baby child, then you have to figure that it wasn't a complete success. Since that's true, you are automatically making the moral assumption that something like that isn't happening when you accept the first thing as a criterion for improvement. All right, so psychotherapy is a very hard case for one to separate the ethics from the practice of science. The ethics is in there. It's a very minimal ethics. It's a very acceptable ethics. It reflects only the minimum ethical axiom that human beings have rights to their own life to at least a limited degree, and to the extent that it doesn't impinge on other human beings. So it's not a very highly debatable one, but it's there. Take another case of an applied social science. Education is, at least supposedly, a case of an applied social science. Educational research lays the foundations, and then in the classroom we apply it. That's not quite how things go, since virtually nobody that teaches, certainly at the college level, knows anything about educational research whatsoever, so they can presumably not be applying it. Or if they're applying it, they're doing so at an intuitive level. Nevertheless, there is a kind of general background picture of what's happening there, which is that where educational research does produce results of some interest, for example, in some of the work from Illinois on the logical content of teacher talk, then one can certainly look at the question of whether this might not result in better learning by the student if, in fact, you made a very big effort to make teachers ask questions a very large proportion of the time and make much fewer statements of fact or opinion. So you can certainly investigate that, and you might well find that in certain cases this proves beneficial to the learning of the students. Now, The problem is that you might find, for example, that the application of some of the Milgram work makes it perfectly clear that the fastest way to get the little monsters on top of the times table is to hit them with 240 volts every time they miss the answer. Now that clearly does have quite strong effects in the direction of, if you can strap them in for long enough to take it. So it's a case of applied social research of a very practical kind. The payoff is in the right dimension. It's cost effective as all get out. However, there is a problem about it, and the problem is not that it doesn't work, not that it's too costly, but just that it's unethical. Now you might say, fine, well, here's where the ethics is dragging us down. I mean, the science was fine until we brought in the ethical component. The problem, however, is that you can't quite separate it off like that. There is this problem of defining education. When you define psychotherapy, you find that the subject has a commitment, a logical commitment to improvement. And if it can't show the improvement, something which involves a moral dimension, it isn't psychotherapy. It is research into process. Similarly with education, the logical commitment in education has a moral component. Education is not just the process of treating people so that they come out with some learning they didn't go in with. It involves certain limitations on the type of treatment that's possible. It isn't education if it is just brainwashing. It isn't education if it is just hypnosis or just suggestion or just electroshock. Even though people come out of electroshock with very changed patterns of behavior, for better or for worse in terms of what you wanted, it's certainly radically changed. It doesn't follow that it's education. Education doesn't mean the same as change in the cognitive domain or affective domain. It means change for the better, and the better has got moral teeth in it. The process has to be under certain moral constraints to be education. Otherwise, it's propaganda, brainwashing, indoctrination, etc., all the things we try to distinguish from education. There are many other examples, but you can see the way in which I'm going after the problem. I'm trying to show that the very definition of some areas of applied social science involves a moral dimension. If you can't check off on the morality of some of the activities that go on there, you haven't got psychotherapy, education, whatever it happens to be. All you've got is fooling around, doing something with something happening as a result, which is not the same thing as these areas. So, if we take the conventionally defined sub-areas of the sciences, of which we have to include things like medicine and education and so on, then we find that there are within those sub-areas occasions when the moral component comes into the definition of the sub-area. Hence, it's a mistake to suppose that you can keep the ethical dimension out of the scientific practice, the scientific enterprise. Now, notice the difference between this and a situation like doing agricultural research, where the effect of your work is to put farm laborers out of a job and reduce the costs to giant agribusiness of the farming process, thereby giving them room to mark up the profit a little bit more. It may well be regarded, and certainly is regarded by the United Farm Workers, as an immoral activity. Whether it is or not, it certainly is not going to be a case of definitional involvement with ethics. You can't argue that it wouldn't be agricultural research if it put farm workers out of a job. It's agricultural research whether it does that or not. Similarly, the work of the social scientists on counterinsurgency efforts by dictators in cooperation with the CIA, it could certainly be said to be immoral, but it couldn't be denied that it was research on applied sociology, whether or not it was moral. So that I am not making the feeble point that science can be applied for good and bad ends. Of course it can, and is. It can also not be applied. It can be so abstract it has no application, and all sorts of possibilities like that emerge. I'm making quite a different point. The first point, the feeble point, is the point that the radical left was making. They were saying this instrument, science, actually is being used for moral and immoral ends. Let's be more careful about how we use it. And they wrongly concluded from that, you see the whole notion of value-free science was a farce. Not at all. Because the notion of value-free science is the notion that science does not make any internal value judgments, has no value judgments in this central space. It was never the notion that you can't apply it to a moral or immoral end. Of course you can apply it like anything else to a moral or immoral end. The doctrine of value-free social science was never the doctrine that it can't be or isn't applied for moral or immoral ends. Of course not. And so, of course, the establishment power figures in the sciences, particularly the social sciences, when that attack began, leant back with a smile in their armchairs because they knew this ammunition was just shooting over their heads. They might be in a little trouble about their contract income because CIA was going to close down some of these neat little contracts that they had out, but they weren't going to be in any trouble about their basic methodology because they were never, and the radical left were not telling them, that within science you could come up with a moral value judgment conclusion that you could support with purely scientific and definitional premises. The radical left sometimes thought that was the case, and sometimes they thought it wasn't the case. They're sort of confused about it, just as Marx is confused about whether or not ethics is a device for subduing the proletariat, or whether it's something that can be invoked in the cause of the revolution. These things are very difficult for the radical left to handle. But whatever they're doing, they were not providing tough arguments against the view that there isn't any way within science to generate value judgments. The two examples I've given you, psychotherapy and education, are examples where within the science, from the definition of psychotherapy plus the results of the investigations, you generate conclusions like what you're doing to this patient is not beneficial for the patient or society or both, and you mean not just beneficial in the sense of the patient's self-concept, but ethically, socially beneficial. So you're making the value judgment within the science. So they're much stronger examples. But let's take the toughest possible stance and look at it. The toughest possible stance is to say that, in fact, scientific moral reasoning are not different because they're exactly the same. That doesn't mean that every little minute detail of statistical analysis is somehow loaded with ethical significance. It's not. It just means that the general logic of the arguments about, for example, the death penalty and its rightness or wrongness are moral arguments and scientific arguments both. Now, that doesn't mean that the same old arguments we've had so far about the death penalty or about abortion as they stand, both moral and scientific arguments. As they stand, there tends to be a slice of scientific argument going on and a slice of ethical argument going on about, say, abortion. Here we're having a discussion about how early the autonomic nervous system is working. We're having a discussion about how early the fetus can survive outside the womb. We're talking about the point at which it begins to feel pain. Scientific discussions. Over here, we're trying to convert those into moral conclusions by saying, so it's really a human being at this point, and so it would be murder to kill it. And these things seem to be fairly well separated. So I'm not arguing, and they are quite well separated. I'm not arguing for a moment that the scientific discussion as conventionally and presently undertaken really is a moral discussion in and of itself. Not at all. No, I just want to say something different, namely this, that both of those are correctly called parts of science. This is physiology for the most part, and this is ethics for the most part, a little bit of reference to the physiology, but both of them are included in a proper conception of science. Now, in order to be included in a proper conception of science, we're not going to be able to distort the meaning of the term science so that every capricious moral debate is going to be rechristened scientific. It isn't any more scientific than the discussions of astrological predictions are that go on in the horoscope magazines. And we're not going to rechristen it and say that it is. What we're going to call ethics is the best shot at moral discussion that you can get in this area, the best kind of moral discussion. Just as you are not going to call the worst type of discussions about naturopathic medicine physiology, you're only going to call physiology what is, in the evaluative sense, the best state of the art in the science. That's what we're going to take in ethics. Now, what is the best shot at ethical discussion? Well, we need to get down a couple of brief indications of this, and then we will have just about run into the time when we ought to be talking together about it and not having me go on at length. I'll just indicate the outline of the argument here. It goes like this. First, you've got to decide what counts as ethics. What is the defining feature of ethics? I suggest that that's not particularly difficult. The defining feature of ethics is simply that it is a system of determining the relative superiority of attitudes and forms of behavior between people, which results from a single principle. And the principle is that the people involved, affected, are to be regarded as having prima facie equal rights. You can look at what's happening in a society from the point of view of the sociologist. That's just the search for truth, the discussion of the nature of the interactions between these people, the social dynamics of the group, and so on. That's a perfectly understandable enterprise. We've been engaged in it for a very long time. But you may undertake a game theoretic analysis of what they're doing. For example, supposing that some of them are playing a game. Now, you can describe exactly what happens in that game, but if you know something about game, well, let's suppose it's chess and you know a lot about chess. It's very easy for you to be able to make evaluative statements. For example, this guy should have castled earlier. It's too late now. Responding to the Latvian opening this way is very, very poor play indeed. Evaluative statements. Now, they're pretty easy to substantiate. You appeal to your knowledge of chess to do so. And if you've got a very good knowledge of chess and the error is a fairly blunt error, then you can pretty easily identify it as an error and make the value judgment. All right, now we're looking at a larger scale of activity. We're looking at the market in a relatively primitive society. And we're noticing the way in which the trading goes on, the currency that evolves and its implicit functions as well as its explicit functions. All right, we can look at that and just describe it. Or we can look at it from the game theory point of view and solve the problems. That is, you can look at it and say, look, here's what essentially they're doing. They're using it as an exchange medium in certain areas of exchange, but not in others. Service has not been made equivalent to the money yet. Now, if they were to do so-and-so, they would get a very large breakthrough in the relative economies of scale that they get from the use of something or other. Very easy to do this. You're experienced in looking at markets all over the place. You're experienced in game theory. It's just like the chess case. You finish up saying, I've looked carefully at whether this would lead to cultural fractures of other kinds. There's no sign that it would. Conclusion, they ought to start doing so-and-so. They should start doing so. They should make the money stone wheels from the Polynesian Trust Territories. They should make them smaller so they would be portable. That would have this result. Of course, they had them large because it prevented theft, but now there's a way to handle that in another way. It'll pay off to do it this way. What are you doing? You're making evaluations about the market arrangements that they have. Now, economists are notoriously incompetent at doing this with respect to our own market mechanism, which they presumably know better than they do the Trebriand Islanders. But it's certainly the case that they are sometimes right. Sometimes they will all agree about some of these claims. And for example, they will agree that the use of excise tariffs in order to protect home industries is a very inferior mechanism, notice the value judgment, to the use of direct subsidy. A long, complicated story about why that's inferior, but there are good economic reasons for saying that it is. Similarly, we're looking at this society. We can certainly draw conclusions about better and worse ways of solving their problems, and sometimes we'll be able to make those stick. There'll be value judgments, but they will be scientifically supportable in just the same way that a judgment about a particular game matrix can be supported by a straight mathematical argument. Now then, suppose we look at a particular type of social interaction, social game that goes on. It's the ethics of the society. That's got a system of rules, just like other games, partly spoken, partly unspoken. It's got a system of sanctions, system of rewards. It's associated with ideologies in various ways. There may be a hierarchy of individuals that are said to have special powers with respect to it. It may be connected to religion, it may not. But it's there, and you can look at it, and you can analyze it in terms of what it succeeds in doing and what bad effects it may have with respect to its own participants. And you can support claims about it would be better if they dropped the death penalty, or it would be better if they reinstated the death penalty, by appealing to the evidence and to the analysis of what the function is of that system. That is simply latent function analysis from social anthropology coupled with game theory analysis. Now, you didn't appeal to prejudices of your own. You're looking at their value system. You're looking at what that system is doing for them. And in the light of that, you're making suggestions for improving the system, recommendations. The situation then is that it's not hard to make evaluations about various ethical systems. Certainly it's not hard in principle, and in particular cases it's relatively easy. Penology is a good example. The death penalty is a very good example. On the present status of the evidence, you just have to say that arguing for the death penalty cannot be given any kind of significant basis. Lots of people who argue for it have the facts wrong. Others may have the facts right but get the implications wrong. Amongst criminologists, you can't find supporters for the death penalty. Amongst people that have been wardens of prisons, you can't find supporters for the death penalty. You can find the support for the death penalty amongst people who are relatively uninformed about it. As an Ohio state legislator said once, leaping to his feet in the middle of a discussion of this, "Don't tell me it isn't a deterrent. I know it's a deterrent. It deters me." No doubt his wife felt much better. Okay, so the outline of the gambit here is a very simple outline. I am saying that if science turns its own tools on looking at the ethical behavior of a society, whether its own society or of others, it is quite easy for it, appealing only to scientific considerations, to get to the point where it can make recommendations that are fully objective about that. It won't be able to do that in all cases. It doesn't follow from the fact that an area is subject to scientific analysis that we can here and now settle every dispute in the area by just saying something which will turn out to be factually right. Of course not. Ethics is one of the most complicated possible areas for investigation because it involves so much of our lives, because so many of us are so different from each other in so many ways, and so many compromises and trade-offs are involved that you can't predict the outcome of reliably. Of course you won't be able to come up with a scientifically bulletproof answer to most ethical questions, but certainly to some. And it won't be something that involves a breach of logical rules. So, ethics defined in the very simple way that I defined it is simply a subject which investigates the best ways in which people can behave with respect to each other or view each other, best here defined as being paying off in terms of the values that they have, not in ethical terms. Investigated simply as a functionally efficient or inefficient system with respect to the values which it purportedly serves, and you will be able to come up with the basic outlines of an ethical system which you have achieved through purely scientific approaches. We could not do that if any of that previous logical argumentation which showed that science can't possibly contain any of this kind of recommendation language, if any of that was sound, of course, this would be an absurd enterprise. None of it is sound, and as a result, this is a possible enterprise. Whether it can be done requires considerable more detail than I've been able to provide now, but at least this will give you an outline, and perhaps some of you will want to stay and ask questions about it. Let's start questions right away and see if you've got some on your mind. Yes.